Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Call of Duty Black Ops 2. This is the 9th game in the Call of Duty series, and it was developed by Treyarch and published by Activision in November of 2012. What you're seeing here is the PC version, but it was also released on Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Wii U. Now you're probably looking at the title and going, hang on DW, why are you not reviewing this one? Is it as bad as Call of Duty 3? No, it's not as bad as Call of Duty 3. So I'll get to the reason why this is an MTO rather than a full review later on in the video, but let's first talk about how this thing was actually received, because it's going to vary wildly depending on who you talk to. If you talk to the legions of dumbasses who seem to think that Call of Duty is the worst thing in the universe, then they're going to act like, oh my god, this is the worst game ever. Whereas if you ask the typical gaming press, they're like, oh my god, this game is great. So obviously reality lies somewhere in between that. So let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with when we say Call of Duty Black Ops 2. Well, as far as presentation goes, it actually still holds up surprisingly well. The modeling is generally very well done, the animations are rather smooth and fluid, a lot of it's mocapped, so that ends up working out quite nicely in its favor, and the environmental art in particular is extremely well done. You can say all you want about how linear this game is and how cramped the maps are in the multiplayer, but you have to admit, at least aesthetically, they are detailed to a fault. About the only things that fall short in terms of visuals are the FOV, which is really hit or miss, because the default FOV is 65 degrees. That's become fairly typical for Call of Duty at this point. Now, the FOV slider allows it to be pushed up to 90 degrees, but only in the main parts of the single player, the multiplayer, and the zombies mode. If you try to go into the Strike Force missions, it goes back to 65 degrees, and I have absolutely no idea why. This means that for most of the game, it's fine, but when you try to go into a Strike Force mission, suddenly you're dealing with nausea and headaches. It just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to have it work perfectly fine for most of the game and then just suddenly on a few of the missions that are this weird tactical style system, suddenly you're back to the irritating console FOV. Just inconsistent and definitely a problem. And the other main issue with the graphics is the texture quality, which mostly is alright, it's just nothing particularly special. You gotta keep in mind that even though the PC version of this is actually fairly decent as far as PC versions go, this was really developed more for PS3 and Xbox 360. Both of which were on their last legs when this thing came out. The Xbox One and PlayStation 4 were right around the corner and were pretty significant upgrades over the previous consoles. And textures were one of the big things that would improve when they moved over to the newer gen of consoles. So by the time this came out, as far as texture quality goes on PC, it was starting to look a bit dated. That's not to say that the textures are undetailed, it's just that they're not quite the res that we would want them to be on a PC game. Then you move over into sound design, and that's where things start to get a lot spottier. The music is primarily electronic in this game, and it's actually a pretty decent soundtrack. Of course, it's rather forgettable outside of the confines of the game, but while you're in the game, it ends up working pretty well for the most part. Then there's the voice acting, which is actually rather well done across the board. That's one thing that Call of Duty hasn't really had any problems with for quite a while now. And Black Ops 2 is no exception there. The actors do a rather good job with what they're given. The problem is that what they're given is pretty crap, but that's something for a bit later on in the video. But when you go into the sound effects themselves, you find that they're really hit or miss. Some of them are okay, but most of the weapon sounds are relatively weak. A lot of them are just reused across the board. Particularly when you get to the sections of the campaign that take place in the 80s, where pretty much all of the automatic weapons sound exactly the same. As do the pistols, and the submachine guns, and everything within a given category for that matter. And absolutely none of the weapon sounds end up sounding particularly powerful. They're tolerable at best. Of course, that's nothing really new for the Call of Duty series. They've never really had very good weapon sounds, and they've never really had very good explosion sounds either, which are really, really basic in this. They just have nowhere near enough bass. It's really a shame, because this is a problem that has really plagued the entire Call of Duty series, and it seems like they haven't really figured it out even to this day. But the real problems with this game don't really lie in its presentation so much as they lie in its story and gameplay. And since those are what really matter here, ultimately they're what also tank the experience. Now the single player has you going through two different timelines. The first of these is the current day timeline of 2025 and you play as David Mason, known as Section, throughout the course of the game. And you're basically trying to track down the leader of a populist movement called Cordis Die. Said movement is big in organizing cyber attacks across the world to cause all kinds of chaos. Their leader is Raul Menendez, and in the other timeline that you go through, which is set in the late 1980s, you're basically going through the events that led to Raul Menendez becoming the leader of Cordis Die and posing such a massive threat to the entire world. And in that timeline, you play as Alex Mason, who is, of course, David's father. And throughout the course of the game, it switches between these two different timelines to fill you in on events that would have led to what you're seeing in the current timeline. So you go from something that is very, very similar to what you would see in previous Call of Duty games to something that is a lot more futuristic. At the same time, you're switching perspectives, and you very quickly find out that the different decisions you make throughout the course of the game can actually have an effect on the outcome of the story. You heard me right. Call of Duty Black Ops 2 not only has branching story paths with different endings, but it actually has quite a few variations of those endings. Now granted, none of those endings are any good because the actual story is a completely jumbled mess that makes almost no sense whatsoever, so that's a bit of a moot point. But the fact remains that that was actually quite a bit of innovation for a Call of Duty game, which is normally extremely linear to a fault. It's just too bad that the variations of endings you get are basically rendered moot by the fact that there is one canonical ending that eventually leads to the events of Black Ops 3, but still. The real problem is the path you have to take to get to those endings, though, because the story, like I said, is a jumbled mess that barely makes any sense at all. And despite what some people have said, Menendez is really not an empathetic villain. Really none of the characters are all that easy to latch onto. I mean, the characters you're playing as in the previous timeline, the 1980s timeline, kind of do horrible things for horrible reasons, and they get caught up in things that are way beyond them, so they don't react to it very well. And when we move over into the modern timeline, the characters just fall flat. I mean, the one commanding officer you get, Briggs, is just really fond of the word fuck for some reason. No, really, he says it in what seems like almost every other line of dialogue. In fact, it seems to be his only real defining trait. And of course, when you move over to other characters, Woods is an asshole, Alex Mason is flat and lifeless, David Mason is flat and lifeless, Harper just gets annoying after a while, and then when you finally get to Menendez himself, he's just a psycho. They try to make him a sympathetic villain by showing you his reason for wanting to plunge the entire world into chaos, but then you look at it and go, wait a minute, you were crazy before this happened, and now you're just using it as an excuse. Because the entirety of the content preceding what ultimately becomes his motivation for plunging the world into chaos consists of Menendez doing this.
¡Josefina! ¡Josefina! ¡Tengo que llegar a la casa! ¡Huepa! ¡Date hasta la casa!
Yeah, Treyarch's obsession with violence, bloodshed, and brutality is on full display here. But anyway, now you probably understand why I say he's just a psycho. And unlike in Treyarch's previous entry in the Black Ops series, it ultimately ends up falling completely flat on its face because it doesn't have that kind of pulpy charm that Black Ops 1 did. Instead, you're left with something that is pretty much convinced of its own magnificence and is completely over the top and ridiculous despite taking itself rather seriously. It ends up being a story that just seems like it was scraps from the cutting room floor of Black Ops 1 mixed in with a few futuristic elements that Treyarch said, you know what, screw it, we're going to put this in the next Call of Duty game. And ultimately, it just leaves you scratching your head more often than not. So what it ultimately falls down to are two things, the gameplay and the sheer amount of content in Call of Duty Black Ops 2. As far as single-player gameplay goes, it's a standard Call of Duty game. You run around, you shoot hordes and hordes and hordes of enemies with your 2-weapon limit, and you have a bunch of gadgets that you can use as you go through the levels. Occasionally the game will let you go into a turret segment or use a vehicle to try to spice things up a bit, and it does have a decent amount of variety throughout the course of the campaign. That's all pretty much the standard kind of thing that you're used to for Call of Duty games at this point, but they do try to throw in a couple of interesting elements throughout the course of the single-player campaign. The first of those things is the idea of being able to change the outcome of the story with your actions. Now, all the levels are very, very linear, but certain things that you can do within those levels will allow you to change the outcome of the story. For example, if you're too slow to catch up to somebody, then something happens, and if you're fast enough to catch up with them, then something else will happen. That alone adds some variety to the gameplay that we just weren't really expecting from Call of Duty. The other main change is that they introduced something called Strike Force missions into the single-player campaign. These are missions that you can deploy strike forces to, and you control them in a sort of hybrid first-person shooter with also this tactical element to complete the various objectives. Those can be things like rescue somebody, or take out certain targets, or capture a certain objective, things like that, as well as defend locations. And the idea is is that more than it simply being a first-person shooter, you're able to go into this tactical mode in order to order your squads around to do different things. In theory, it's actually a really cool idea to see something of a tactical element brought to a series that's not really known for being tactical. Gives it a bit more of a Rainbow Six vibe. The problem is that the implementation is crap. The AI in this game is, for lack of a better term, stupid. They end up being more useless than anything else, and when you're ordering your soldiers around, they just end up getting themselves killed all the time. Trying to place sentry guns or move the automated vehicles around is just an absolute pain, and they really do not help you much in the long run either. So more often than not, what you end up doing is ordering those vehicles and such around to create a distraction, and then you just hop into the boots of one particular soldier and go off and complete the objectives on your own. Of course, in a lot of cases, that's easier said than done. You see, the game has a really nasty penchant for throwing tons and tons of enemies at you at once, and them just all mowing you down at exactly the same time. It is incredibly frustrating to deal with. Now, of course, you could ignore the Strike Force missions. They're not required to complete the game, but they do have an effect on the outcome of the story, which is, needless to say, pretty frustrating. And even better, you're actually limited on the number of Strike Force missions you can go on by the amount of Strike Forces you have, which goes down if you fail a mission or if you back out of one. This adds to the frustration and ultimately makes the Strike Force missions more trouble than they're worth, especially when all of the problems that the main single-player campaign has are also carried over into the Strike Force missions, like the enemies having pinpoint accuracy no matter what their range is, or enemies spawning behind you in large numbers and then just mowing you down before you have much of a chance to react. But one thing the Strike Force missions don't have is scripted events that end up being incredibly irritating. Like the mission that ultimately caused me to stop playing the single player and what ultimately made this an MTO rather than a full review. In that particular mission, you have to run down a hallway to avoid an incoming gunship mowing you down. Except that no matter what you seem to do, you always get mowed down by the gunship, or if you try to jump like it tells you to do, then you end up falling to your death. I kept wondering what it was I was doing wrong. Was I running into an NPC and that was tripping the whole thing up? Or was I moving too slowly when I decided not to go ahead and sprint? Or was I just not using the sprint jump effectively enough? Or what was it? And I just couldn't nail down what exactly the problem was, so I just said, you know what, screw it, I'm done with the single player campaign. Because quite honestly, the single player in this game, despite trying to innovate somewhat, ultimately ended up falling flat on its face. And what really matters to most people in terms of Call of Duty is the multiplayer component, which I actually played quite a lot of because I played it quite frequently when it had free weekends, and I also played it when I got the full game. I mean, the multiplayer component even spills over into the single player in some elements, namely the loadout system, where in the single player you can actually choose your loadout before going into a mission, which is really refreshing, and I'm very glad they did that. Likewise, I'm glad that multiplayer got a pretty decent overhaul from what we were used to from the Call of Duty series at that point. This was the game that introduced the Pick 10 system. You get 10 points to spend on the various weapons, the attachments, the perks, all that sort of thing. And that gives you a tremendous amount of freedom to mess with your loadout and pick something that you really want to play. If you want to run around and only use the knife, then that's perfectly fine. The game will support that. If you want to set it up to where you only have a primary weapon and you gear everything towards that, game supports that too. It is a really nice system that works really well, and they did continue using it throughout the rest of the series so far. Likewise, they changed up all of the kill streaks into just being score streaks, so you just earn score in order to build up your streaks and thus get all the rewards of those. The problem is that they didn't quite go far enough with it. Similar to the previous Black Ops game, you have an in-game currency that you use to unlock stuff, and those are tokens. You get the tokens simply by leveling up over the course of the game, and then you can use them to unlock the various equipment, the perks, all that sort of thing, to your heart's content. The problem is that they also lock the perks and the weapons and such behind level requirements. This is something that has plagued the entire series, and I wish they would just do away with it. It's one thing to put the unlocks behind just needing the required number of tokens or the required amount of in-game currency that you earn simply by playing the game. It's another thing entirely to give blatant advantages to people who've just played the game longer and thus been able to unlock stuff. And going to a sort of hybrid system between both extremes means that you end up with just kind of a mess. To make matters worse, you have to unlock attachments by continually using the various weapons, and thus they end up leveling up, which is just a dumb idea, and I wish they did away with that. Or at the very least only made the weapon leveling for cosmetic items. But luckily there's not really a glaring balancing problem. There's some mild issues here and there, but for the most part the default loadouts are perfectly sufficient for being able to succeed at the game. And while certainly your custom loadouts can get a lot of advantages toward a particular playstyle, or even some disadvantages, it's not really enough that the playing field is completely uneven. Although there are certainly a few things here and there where you can go, I don't know about that. But it's certainly no Modern Warfare 2 in that regard, let's put it that way. But I digress. Those things are certainly sufficient to change up the gameplay style of the multiplayer, at least enough to where you can tell this is a different game from the predecessors. But other than that, it's still pretty much the same multiplayer you've come to expect, which means that it's pretty fast-paced, it's arcadey, it's mostly fun, although it can be frustrating sometimes because a lot of your deaths will come from behind. And if I remember correctly, the game actually uses dedicated servers for its multiplayer, or at least it did when I played it originally, so that's actually a pretty decent bonus to keep everything on a fairly even playing field. I never really ran into lag problems in this like I did in other games in the series that use peer-to-peer. So if nothing else, they deserve kudos for creating a pretty stable, mostly pretty fun experience in terms of the versus multiplayer. Although if you weren't a fan of that style of multiplayer to begin with, then this game isn't going to be the one to win you over. Much like if you go over to the zombies mode and you were never really all that much of a fan of zombies, then you're really not going to get much out of that either. And I certainly fall into that category. I don't get much of anything out of the zombies mode, so I barely played it. It's just not my thing. I really do not like zombies. I find them ridiculously boring, and that was the case with Black Ops 2's zombies mode as well. Your mileage may vary on that. For some baffling reason, you might absolutely love the zombies mode. I don't know why you love it, but whatever. That's your prerogative. It was never really my thing to begin with, so the most I'll really say for it is it's Call of Duty Zombies, and if you like that, then you'll like it here. And the thing is, when you bring all of it together, even if you completely discount the single-player experience as being pretty much worthless, the zombies and the multiplayer are more than enough to make up the experience for most people. If you come into it expecting a good Call of Duty single-player campaign, you're probably going to be very disappointed, but if you go into it just looking to play the multiplayer, then you'll be able to enjoy it. And that's really the problem, because I didn't finish the single-player campaign. That is the only reason this is not a full review. Because quite honestly, I played a crap ton of the multiplayer, and for the most part, I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. It wasn't perfect, don't get me wrong, but it was still an enjoyable experience for the most part. Albeit pretty stale, but then again, I've played all of the Call of Duty games up to this point except for Infinite Warfare. If you haven't played all that many entries in the Call of Duty series, then you'll probably be able to get more out of this than I did. But really, the issue is that by this point, the Call of Duty series was rather stale, and while the futuristic setting and the changes to the single-player campaign definitely are a step in the right direction, they kind of backpedaled on that and went over into, wait a minute, what are we doing territory with Black Ops 3. But at this point, since very few people are still playing Black Ops 2, there's really not that much reason for you to pick it up unless for some baffling reason you really want to play the entire Black Ops saga. But quite frankly, the only good single-player campaign in the entirety of the Black Ops series so far has been the first game, because Black Ops 2 and 3's single-player campaigns just plain old suck. So while the original Black Ops kind of had it all and was still a really solid game overall, but Black Ops 2 is just kind of a mess, and Black Ops 3 has the absolute worst single-player campaign in the entirety of the Black Ops series. And since the single-player is one of the rather weak elements of the game, ultimately there's not really that much reason to get Black Ops 2 anymore. At launch you could have gotten quite a bit out of the multiplayer, but these days it's kind of difficult to actually find games in this thing. Most people either moved on to later entries in the Call of Duty series, or they moved on to other games entirely. And quite honestly, I can't blame them, because by this point the series was just getting ridiculously stale, and afterwards it hasn't really been able to find its footing since. And that's really a shame, because this game actually had some good ideas in it, it's just that they weren't implemented all that well. And what you're left with is a very underwhelming game as a result. Thanks for watching.